He grabbed her field manual off the bar, held it over his head, and tore it in half. Then he poured his entire beer over the pieces. The bar went silent. Sergeant Tyler Brennan looked down at Specialist Sarah Kincaid and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's all your career is worth, sweetheart. Paper and cheap beer." He had no idea he was looking at the most dangerous sniper the United States military had ever produced. He had no idea she had already memorized every weakness he had. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story to the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Murphy's Tavern sat 3 miles off base, close enough to Fort Campbell that the parking lot was always half military vehicles, far enough that soldiers felt like they could breathe without a uniform straightening their spine. On a Thursday night in late October, the place was loud, warm, and smelled of fried food and spilled domestics. The jukebox was working its way through a rotation of classic rock that nobody was listening to. Booths were packed, bar stools were claimed, and the kind of laughter that only happens when men feel completely untouchable bounced off the low wooden ceiling. Sergeant Tyler Brennan held court at the center of it all. He was built like he had been assembled specifically for the purpose of intimidation, broad across the shoulders, square-jawed with the kind of physical confidence that came from years of being the most capable person in any given room. He wore it naturally the way some men wear a good coat. His Squad 8 Rangers, all of them from the same elite unit, all of them carrying the same unspoken certainty that they were the tip of the spear spread around him like a solar system with one sun. They had been back from their last rotation for 11 days. That was long enough to decompress, long enough to miss the intensity, and just short enough that they still felt invincible. Rangers returning from deployment have a particular energy. It is not arrogance exactly, though it looks like it from the outside. It is more like a volume dial turned all the way up. Everything louder, everything bigger, every joke funnier, every slight magnified. Sarah Kincaid sat alone at the far end of the bar. She had a glass of water in front of her. Not a beer, not a cocktail. Water with a slice of lemon she hadn't touched. She had a field manual open on the bar beside her glass, a pen in her right hand, and she was reading. Actually reading in the middle of a crowded bar on a Thursday night, the way some people read on trains, completely inside the text, completely outside the room around her. She was 29 years old and looked younger. 5'4", slight through the shoulders, with dark hair pulled back in a bun, so practical. It was almost aggressive. She was still in her duty uniform because she had come straight from work and hadn't bothered to change. Her rank insignia said Specialist. Her name tape said Kincaid. Nothing about her said anything at all, which was, if anyone had been paying attention, exactly the point. Nobody was paying attention. The first time Tyler Brennan noticed her, it was because one of his guys, a wiry corporal named Deeks, with a laugh like a screen door, nudged him and said loud enough to carry, "Hey, Sarge, check out the supply clerk over there studying for a test she's never going to use." Brennan turned, looked. His expression moved through amusement and landed somewhere near contempt. "Supply," he said. "Not a question. An assessment. Yeah, that tracks. She comes here every Thursday," the bartender said, not looking up from the glass he was drying. His name was Pete, and he had watched enough of these interactions to know how they ended. "Reads, doesn't bother anybody." "Doesn't bother anybody," Brennan repeated, and he said it in a way that made the phrase sound like a character flaw. He picked up his beer and walked toward her, and his squad followed, because that was what they did. Sarah did not look up when he stopped beside her stool. "You're in my seat," he said. She turned a page. The sign on the door says first come, first served. Brennan looked at his guys. A few of them were already grinning. "She's got a sense of humor," he said. "I didn't know supply clerks were allowed to have those." "We get a half day for it every other Friday," Sarah said. That got a short laugh from one of his men, quickly swallowed. Brennan's jaw shifted. He pulled out the bar stool next to her and sat down close enough that it was a choice, not an accident. He leaned an arm on the bar and turned his body toward her with the particular posture of a man who has decided that the conversation is now going to go differently. "How long you been in?" he asked. 7 years. 7 years. He looked at the specialist rank on her collar. 7 years and you're still in E4. That's not a good sign." "Depends what you're looking for," she said. He picked up her field manual and turned it over in his hand, reading the cover with the exaggerated attention of someone performing interests they don't have. Infantry tactics. Huh. Why does a supply clerk need to know infantry tactics? Why does a ranger need to take other people's bar stools? She replied. The squad rippled with suppressed reaction. Deeks turned away to hide a smile. Brennan put the manual down harder than he needed to. You know what I think, he said. I think you sit in here and read those manuals because you wish you were something else, something more, and that's fine. Some people are built for the front and some people are built for the back. Nothing wrong with the back. He paused. As long as you know which one you are. Sarah finally looked up from the page. She looked at him the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not with feeling, with information. Her eyes moved across his face down to his hands, across his posture, back up. It lasted about 3 seconds. It was the most unsettling 3 seconds Tyler Brennan had experienced in recent memory, and he could not have explained why. Your left shoulder, she said, we're a rotator cuff. You favor it when you reach. The way you picked up that manual, you led with your right hand and let your left follow half a beat late. Old injury, not recent. You've compensated for it long enough that it's become habit. Her voice was flat, clinical, like she was reading from a chart. The scar on your right forearm, partially hidden by your sleeve, that's not combat. That's a training accident, probably a repelling burn, 2, maybe 3 years old. She tilted her head slightly. And you've been back from rotation for less than 2 weeks. Eastern Theater, given the dust patterns still in the stitching of your bootlaces. Helmand or Kandahar, I'd guess Helmand. The bar around them had gone quieter than it had been all night. Brennan stared at her. What did you just say? I said you've been back 11 days, she replied, and she looked down at her page again. Roughly. The silence stretched out 1 beat too long. Then Deeks broke it with a laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. How does she know that? She doesn't know anything, Brennan said, and his voice had lost the easy amusement. Something harder had replaced it. She read a manual. She's guessing. I don't guess, Sarah said. Brennan reached over and picked up her field manual again, but this time he held it with both hands and with a slow deliberateness that made the action worse than if it had been impulsive. He tore it down the spine. The sound of it was sharp and final. Then he lifted his beer glass and tilted it, and the amber liquid poured in a steady stream over the torn pages, soaking the paper spreading across the bar. He set the empty glass down. That's all your career is worth, he said, paper and cheap beer. Sarah looked at the ruined manual. She looked at the beer dripping off the bar. Then she looked at Tyler Brennan, and her expression did not change. Not anger, not hurt, not the tears he might have expected, or the explosion he might have preferred, because at least that would have been a reaction, he understood. Nothing. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out a folded $20 bill, and placed it on the bar beside the mess. For Pete's trouble, she said quietly. Then she picked up her pen, capped it, slid it into her chest pocket, and stood up from the stool with the unhurried composure of someone who had already finished what they came to do. She buttoned the top button of her jacket and she walked toward the door. Brennan watched her go. What is her problem? Deeks asked. She doesn't have one, Pete said from behind the bar, wiping up the mess with a rag and pocketing the 20 without comment. That's what should be worrying you. Nobody at that table could explain why those words sat in them the way they did. But they did. Even after the next round arrived and the noise of the bar swallowed the moment whole, something about the way that woman had walked out of the door, unhurried, upright, like she was the only person in the room who already knew how the story ended, stayed with Tyler Brennan longer than he would ever admit. Outside, the night was cold and clear and smelled of coming rain. Sarah Kincaid walked to her truck, unlocked it, and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. She breathed in once, breathed out. Then she reached into the glove box, removed an identical copy of the same field manual, and set it on the passenger seat beside her. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The number was one she recognized, but never expected to see on a night like this. She answered. Kincaid, she said. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Vincent Davis, and what he said in the next 40 seconds changed the entire shape of what the night was going to become. She listened without speaking. When he was done, she said, Understood. I'll be there in 8 minutes. She ended the call. She sat for 3 more seconds, completely still, in the way that people are still when they are not resting but calculating. Then she started the truck. There are things about Sarah Kincaid that do not appear in the standard service record accessible to the average military personnel officer. Her official file lists her MOS military occupational specialty as 92A, Automated Logistical Specialist, Supply. The file shows a soldier of middling rank, steady evaluations, no disciplinary flags, no commendations worth noting. It is the file of someone invisible, deliberately, comprehensively, architecturally invisible. The real file is stored in a system that requires 3 separate clearance levels to access, and the name on that file is not Sarah Kincaid. The name on that file is a designation Phantom 5. She had been recruited out of basic training by a program that does not advertise itself and does not exist in any document that has ever been declassified. The program identified candidates through a combination of metrics that the Army did not officially acknowledge, measuring reaction time, spatial reasoning, emotional regulation under duress, the ability to remain functionally calm when every nerve in the human body is insisting on panic. Sarah had scored in ranges that made the evaluating psychologist quietly request a second administration of the test because he was certain the results were corrupted. They were not corrupted. She had been shooting since she was 6 years old on a farm in rural Tennessee under the patient instruction of a grandfather who understood that his granddaughter saw the world differently than other people saw: distances, angles, wind speed in the movement of grass, trajectory in the arc of thrown stones, and who had simply decided to teach her what to do with that. By the time she was 22, she had completed sniper qualification at a level that required the Army to create a new scoring tier to accurately reflect it. By 24, she had completed 3 classified deployments in theaters that do not appear in her official record. By 26, she had been assigned to a unit whose operational parameters were so restricted that fewer than 40 people in the entire United States military structure were aware it existed. She had chosen to come to Fort Campbell. She had chosen the supply clerk cover herself. She had argued in a written memo that her commanding officer had kept because it was one of the most precisely reasoned documents he had ever received from any soldier of any rank, that the most effective concealment is the concealment that people choose for you. That if you present the world with a person, it already has a place for unremarkable background. Forgettable, the world will file you away and stop looking. It had worked perfectly for 3 years. She pulled into the restricted access lot behind the administrative block at 19 minutes past 10, which was 11 minutes after Brennan had poured his beer every day over her manual. Colonel Vincent Davis was standing outside the door in civilian clothes, which meant the meeting was already off the books. He was 61 years old, gray at the temples, and had the kind of face that gave nothing away, because giving things away had never been an option in his career. He had known Sarah Kincaid for 7 years, which meant he had known her longer than almost anyone else in her life, and he greeted her the way he always did, with a direct look, a minimal nod, and immediate information. "Walk with me," he said. They walked. Helmand Province, he said, a fire base called Objective Ridgeline. 48 Rangers from the 75th, including Captain Jason Brennan's Alpha Company, moved into a valley at 1900 hours local time for what was supposed to be a 3-hour patrol rotation. At 21:42, they were boxed. 3 sides simultaneous. Estimated hostile force 190 to 200 fighters, heavy weapons, PGs, multiple PKM emplacements. Sarah kept walking. "Air support," she said. "Denied." Cloud ceiling dropped. Apache crews can't operate in those conditions, and the fixed wing assets that can operate in that ceiling are 12 minutes out, but the situation will be decided in 4. CASVAC. 3 men already down, 7 more with wounds that will be critical inside an hour without extraction. The extraction point is inside the kill zone. Sarah stopped walking. She turned to look at Davis. "What's the terrain?" she asked. He handed her a folded satellite image printed on paper that would dissolve in water. She opened it, studied it for exactly the amount of time she needed, refolded it, and handed it back. "The eastern ridgeline," she said, "above the bend in the canal, 2 clicks back from the firebase." "Yes," Davis said. "That's a 2-kilometer shot minimum. Variable wind night conditions, hostile ground between the insertion and the position." "Yes," Davis said. "And you're sending 1 operator." He did not answer because the answer was obvious from the fact that he was standing outside at 10 at night in civilian clothes talking to her instead of activating a full team. "There is no time for a full team," he said. There is no time for anything except this conversation, and then you're either in a vehicle or you're not. Sarah looked at him for a moment, not hesitating, not calculating odds. She had already done both of those things inside the first 30 seconds of the phone call. What she was doing now was something else, the particular compression that happens when a person takes the full weight of what is being asked, holds it, and then agrees to carry it. "Who is Jason Brennan?" she said. The question landed quietly. Davis met her eyes. "Captain, Alpha Company, 28 years old, 3 tours, good officer." A pause. "Tyler Brennan's younger brother." Sarah absorbed that. She did not react to it. She did not allow herself to. The irony of it, the shape of what this night had become in the space of an hour, was noted, filed, and set aside. There was no place for irony on a 2-kilometer ridgeline in the dark. "What's my insertion window?" she said. 22 minutes from now. "I need my kit." "It's already in the vehicle." She nodded. They walked back to the lot. Inside the black SUV that was already running, Sarah changed out of her duty uniform with the efficient deliberateness of someone performing a routine they have performed so many times it requires no thought. The kit waiting for her in the back was hers. She had configured it herself, maintained it herself, knew every component the way a musician knows their instrument. The rifle broke down into a case that looked from the outside like contractor equipment. The case had been in that vehicle for 3 hours, which meant someone had been confident she would say yes, which meant the situation was more critical than even Davis's tone had suggested. She locked the case, settled the weight across her back, and checked her sidearm. Deeks was still at Murphy's Tavern on his 4th beer, telling the story about the supply clerk who had rattled off Tyler's injuries like a party trick. He was performing it for laughs, exaggerating it the way you do when something has rattled you, and you want to make it smaller by making it funnier. Tyler Brennan was quiet at the end of the bar. He was not thinking about the supply clerk. He was thinking about his younger brother, because Jason had called him 6 hours ago from base, and the call had been cut short by something that Jason hadn't explained. Just said he'd call back, and he hadn't called back, and boy, Tyler had told himself it was nothing, and the telling himself had not been entirely convincing. He picked up his beer. He put it down without drinking. "You good?" Deeks asked. "Fine," Tyler said. "I'm fine." He was not fine. 47 minutes after Tyler Brennan poured beer over a woman's field manual in a bar 3 miles off base, that woman was standing in the dark on the edge of a flight line calculating the wind speed in Helmand Province. From atmospheric pressure data she had memorized during the 22-minute drive and reconfiguring her firing solution for conditions she had not yet seen but already somehow understood. The loadmaster of the aircraft gestured her forward. She walked toward it without looking back. Jason Brennan in a shallow drainage ditch in a valley in Afghanistan, with 7 of his men wounded and 41 more pinned under fire that was not decreasing, keyed his radio for the 4th time in 10 minutes and said in the controlled voice of someone who is frightened and refusing to show it, "Command, this is Alpha Actual. We need anything you've got. I don't care what it is. Send me anything." The response that came back was not what he expected. "Alpha Actual, this is Command. Asset is in transit. ETA is 14 minutes. Hold your position." Jason looked at the man beside him, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, who had been with him for 2 tours and who Jason trusted more than he trusted most of his blood relatives, and said, "1 asset, they're sending 1. Webb looked at him. "1, Jason repeated. Webb said nothing for a moment. Then what kind of asset? Jason didn't know. He keyed the radio again. "Command confirm, what is the classification of the asset?" A pause. 3 seconds. 5. "Then Alpha Actual asset is classified. Just hold the line. 14 minutes. Jason set the radio down. An RPG detonated 40 meters to his left, close enough that he felt the pressure wave in his chest, and 3 of his men flinched in the darknesses and did not speak because there was nothing to say. 14 minutes. He put his head back against the dirt wall of the ditch and breathed. He had no way of knowing that the asset command had promised him had 11 days earlier sat at a bar on the same base as his brother. He had no way of knowing that she had read that morning's atmospheric data. The drive to the flight line had already accounted for a 12-degree wind shift that would affect ballistics at 2,000 meters, and was at this precise moment stepping out of the back of a vehicle 3 kilometers from where he was bleeding. He had no way of knowing any of that. What he knew was the sound of incoming fire, the weight of 7 wounded men in 14 minutes. He started counting. Tyler Brennan drove back to base at midnight, which was 17 minutes after his phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number, which turned out to be a duty officer relay, which said only contact lost with Alpha Company. Situation developing. Stand by for further. He read it 3 times. His hands on the steering wheel were completely steady because he had trained them to be, and he drove the 3 miles back to base at exactly the speed limit because he was a ranger, and rangers do not lose control of their vehicles or their faces or their breathing. When something goes wrong, and he parked the truck and sat in the dark with the engine off for about 45 seconds before he got out. He walked to the duty office. He asked for information. He was told to wait. He waited. In the bar he had left behind him, Pete the bartender picked up the torn field manual from the trash where it had landed after the mess was cleaned up and turned it over in his hands. The cover was stained and buckled from the beer. The spine was torn clean. Some of the pages were so saturated they had fused together and would not separate without tearing. He stood there holding it for a moment. Then he set it back down behind the bar. Not in the trash in the space between the register and the beer taps where he kept things he wasn't sure what to do with yet. He had been a veteran himself once, a long time ago, and he had seen enough of the world to know that some people wear their danger where you can see it, and some people wear it somewhere you'd never think to look, and the second kind are always, without exception, the ones you should have been more careful about. He wiped the bar. He didn't say anything to anyone. He had a feeling the night wasn't finished yet. He was right about that. The duty office at Fort Campbell at midnight smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, and Tyler Brennan had been sitting in a plastic chair outside the watch commander's door for 41 minutes without moving. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his eyes on the floor, and anyone watching him would have said he looked calm. Anyone who knew him would have known that the stillness was not calm. It was the thing that happens when a person locks every feeling behind a door and stands in front of it with their full body weight, because if they step away from it for 1 second, the door comes open. The watch commander, a lieutenant colonel named Ferris, had told him twice that there was no new information. Tyler had nodded both times and stayed in the chair. He was not leaving. He was not capable of leaving. Jason was out there, and the last transmission from Alpha Company had been 4 words: heavy contact, sustaining casualties. After that static, Deeks had followed him in from the parking lot and was now standing against the wall with his arms crossed, not saying anything, which was how Tyler knew Deeks understood the situation. Deeks talked constantly, reflexively, automatically, the way some people breathe. When he went quiet, it meant something had reached him somewhere below the noise. "How many guys does Jason have?" Deeks said finally. He kept his voice low. 48, Tyler said, "and they have got air support." They had air support, ceiling dropped, Apaches are grounded. Deeks absorbed that. So they're waiting on reinforcements. Reinforcements are 2.5 hours out. Tyler looked up at the clock on the wall. They've been in contact for, he calculated, 53 minutes. Neither of them said what that meant. They didn't need to. The door to the watch commander's office opened, and Ferris stepped out with a tablet in his hand and an expression that Tyler could not immediately read, which was itself a kind of information. "Brennan," Ferris said, "command has an asset in transit to Helmand. ETA on station is approximately 6 minutes from now." Tyler stood up. "What kind of asset?" "Classified." "Sir, my brother has 48 men pinned under fire with air support grounded and reinforcements 2 hours out, and you're telling me the only help command could scrape together is one classified asset?" "I'm telling you what I know," Ferris said. He held Tyler's gaze without flinching. "Which is that command considered the situation and sent what they sent. I'd suggest you trust the process." "With respect, sir." "Sit down, Sergeant." Tyler sat down, but his jaw was working and his hands, still folded, had gone white at the knuckles. 6 minutes. He looked at the clock. He had no way of knowing that 6 minutes away over the mountains of Helmand Province, a woman he had thrown out of a bar stool 3 hours earlier was already in the dark, already moving, already becoming something the night had no language for. 2200 hours, 58 minutes, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The aircraft dropped her from 8,000 feet at the outer edge of the acceptable halo window, which was already pushing the margins of what could be called acceptable. The free fall lasted 44 seconds. She pulled at 1,500 feet, which was lower than protocol, and exactly right for what the terrain required. A low canopy minimized the acoustic and visual signature of the insertion, which meant by the time anyone on the ground might have heard something, she was already down and moving. She landed in a dry riverbed 2 kilometers east of the firebase. She released the chute, compressed it into a hollow in the bank, and covered it with loose stone in under 90 seconds. Then she took her bearings. The sound of the firefight was a continuous low percussion from the west, the sharp crack of small arms, the heavier thump of machine gun fire, and beneath it the shorter, harder concussion of RPGs. It was the sound of a fight that had been going on long enough that both sides had settled into a rhythm, which was actually worse than it sounded. A rhythm meant the enemy was comfortable. A comfortable enemy was a confident one. She moved east and north toward the ridgeline, covering ground at the pace of someone who knows exactly where their feet are going in the dark, which she did. She had memorized the satellite imagery in the vehicle. She had the terrain architecture in her head, with the detail of someone who had spent 3 years learning to build entire landscapes from 2-dimensional photographs. At 2300 hours and 11 minutes, she reached the ridgeline. She found her position in 4 minutes. Not because it was obvious, but because she had already identified it from the image, a natural rock shelf angled slightly downward, offering clear sight lines over the valley at 2,100 meters from the firebase perimeter. She settled into it the way water settles into a vessel, completely without wasted space. She assembled the rifle. She ranged the targets. She keyed her radio. "Command, this is Phantom 5. I'm on station. Give me the picture." The voice that came back was Colonel Davis, which meant he was running this personally from wherever he was, which meant he understood the stakes. Phantom 5 Alpha Company is in a drainage channel running north-south along the western edge of the firebase. Primary threat is a machine gun emplacement at your 1 o'clock, approximately 1,800 meters. Secondary threat is an RPG team that has been cycling in from the north every 4 to 6 minutes. Command element appears to be operating from a compound at your 2 o'clock, 2,200 meters. "Copy," Sarah said. "Civilian structure? Negative. Confirmed hostile." "Copy. I'm going to need Alpha's radio frequency." A pause. "That's outside protocol, Phantom 5. So is sending 1 sniper against 200 fighters, sir. The frequency." Another pause. Then Davis read it out. She switched channels. "Alpha Actual, this is a friendly asset. Do not respond verbally. Acknowledged by keying your radio twice." In the drainage ditch, Jason Brennan heard a voice he did not recognize. Female flat, completely unhurried, come through his radio on a frequency he had not given to anyone. He looked at Webb. Webb looked at him. Jason keyed his radio twice. "Good," the voice said. "I have eyes on your position. I count 44, mobile 4 down. I'm going to start with the machine gun at your northeast. When I do, you'll hear the suppressor, but the enemy won't identify the origin for at least 3 to 4 shots. Use that window to move your wounded to the southern end of the channel. Acknowledge." Jason keyed twice. His hands were completely steady. His mind was going very fast and very quietly, the way it did when something shifted and the shape of a situation changed. "Who is this?" Webb said quietly. Jason shook his head once. It didn't matter who it was. What mattered was the machine gun at the northeast had been pinning his 1st and 2nd squad for 50 minutes, and if it went quiet, he had a window. He started moving down the channel toward his squad leaders. At 2,300 hours and 19 minutes, Sarah Kincaid put her first round downrange. The machine gunner at the northeast emplacement did not hear anything. One moment he was firing, and the next moment he was not, and the 2 men beside him looked at each other in the confusion that precedes understanding. And then Sarah's second round resolved the confusion entirely. The gun went silent. In the channel, Jason said, "Move, now, move." And his men moved. The enemy took 4 seconds to process that the machine gun had stopped. Then they took another 6 to try to raise the crew on radio. Then the radio operator for that emplacement stopped responding because Sarah's 3rd round had found him, and the confusion began to spread through the enemy formation, the way a crack spreads through ice. Not immediately catastrophic, but the structure was already compromised. Back at Fort Campbell, Tyler Brennan was still in the plastic chair. It was now 23:14. He had been there for over an hour. Ferris had stopped coming out to tell him there was no information because Tyler had stopped reacting to it in a way that made it worth telling him. He was just there, solid and immovable in the chair. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number. He answered. Sergeant Brennan? The voice was male-clipped authoritative. This is Colonel Vincent Davis. I want you to know that we have an asset on station at your brother's position as of approximately 15 minutes ago. Tyler stood up. Sir, what's the situation? The situation is developing in a positive direction. Your brother's company is alive and the tactical picture is changing. One asset, sir. You sent one asset. Yes. Against 200 fighters. Yes. Tyler pressed the phone against his ear hard enough that the plastic edge bit into his jaw. Sir, with respect, who did you send? The pause on the other end was brief but specific. The kind of pause that is not hesitation but selection, choosing how much to say. Someone very good, Davis said. That's all I can tell you. Stand by, Sergeant. The call ended. Tyler lowered the phone. He looked at Deeks, who had straightened off the wall when Tyler stood up and was now watching him with the alert stillness of a man waiting for a verdict. They sent one, Tyler said. One operator. Deeks' eyebrows went up. 1 for 200. 1. They looked at each other. Who sends one? Deeks said. Tyler shook his head. He did not have an answer. He sat back down in the chair, and this time he did not look at the floor. He looked at the phone in his hand, and he thought about Jason in a ditch in Helmand with 47 men and 200 fighters and one unknown asset somewhere in the dark. And he thought about what kind of person gets sent alone into a situation like that, and the thinking did not make him feel better. It made him feel something he rarely felt and never talked about, which was a particular species of awe that lives right next to fear. 2331, Helmand Province. Sarah had been on the ridge for 32 minutes and she had changed the battlefield. The machine gun emplacement was silent. The RPG team that had been cycling in from the north had lost 2 of its 4 members on consecutive approaches and had pulled back to reassess, which bought Jason's men 18 additional minutes of suppressed incoming fire from that direction. She had taken out the primary radio operator for the enemy's eastern flank, which meant their left and right elements were no longer coordinating cleanly, which meant the pressure they were applying to the channel was becoming uneven. But the enemy commander had noticed. His name was Zahir. He was 44 years old, experienced in a way that only comes from surviving long enough in violent places to learn the patterns. And he had been watching his formations the way a chess player watches the board. And what he was watching did not make sense. His machine gun crew was silent and not responding. His radio operator on the eastern flank was silent. His RPG team had pulled back reporting fire from an unknown position, and the fire from inside the American channel had not increased. If this were a rescue force, a counter-assault, an airstrike, any of those things, the pattern would be different. There would be volume, there would be noise, there would be the signature of organized force. What he was seeing instead was precision. Single shots widely spaced in different sectors. No pattern to the origin. No sound he could locate. He got on his radio and said in Pashto, "How many are firing from the ridge?" The answer that came back was, "We don't know. We can't find the position." Zahir said, "Find it." 3 teams began moving toward the eastern ridgeline. Sarah had already heard them. Not literally, she was 2 kilometers away, and they were moving with discipline. But she had expected this because she would have done the same thing in their position. And so she had already ranged 3 points along the most logical approach routes to the ridgeline, and she was in the particular interior way of someone whose mind operates in trajectories already done with that problem. It just hadn't happened yet. In the drainage channel, Jason Brennan was doing something that looked from the outside like nothing. He was lying still, listening to his radio, which had gone quiet after the asset's initial communication. His wounded were in the southern section of the channel as directed. His mobile men were distributed along the northern and eastern walls. Webb crawled up beside him. "She hasn't called back." "No," Jason said. "That a good sign or a bad sign? It means she's busy." Webb processed this. "You think it's one person." Jason said nothing. "You think it is, though." The call came from one radio. "The shots don't overlap. There's no coordination pattern." Jason paused. "It's one person." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's insane." "I know. One person against I know why everybody was quiet again then. She's good." "Yeah," Jason said. He looked up at the eastern ridgeline, invisible in the dark above them, and felt something he hadn't felt in the last hour and a half, which was something close to belief. She's very good, 2347. Zahir's three teams were on the ridgeline approach when Sarah made a decision that she had been building toward for 6 minutes. The teams were moving carefully. They were not amateurs, but carefully and quickly are hard to do simultaneously in the dark on rough ground, and the movement had noise. Not loud noise, not obvious noise, but she was listening for it and she heard it. She shifted her angle 14 degrees to the right. The lead man of the first team had a flashlight he was keeping shielded, using it in short pulses to check his footing. It was professionally done. It was not sufficient. Her shot ended his search. The team behind him stopped. She was already adjusting for the second team. On his radio, Zahir heard, "Contact, we're taking fire, position is," and then the transmission ended, and in the silence that followed, he heard something he had not expected to hear, which was nothing. No return fire. No second shooter covering the first. Just the one shot and then the dark. He keyed his radio. All units pull back from the eastern approach. The acknowledgments came back ragged. He put the radio down. He sat with a thought that he had not allowed himself to have for the first 20 minutes of the engagement, which was that this was not what it appeared to be. The Americans in the channel were not a problem he recognized. The Americans had not reinforced. The Americans were being defended by something that was not an army, was not a unit, was not a weapon system he had a counter for. He began to think about what it meant if the thing in the dark was a person. If it was a person, the person had now been firing for 50 minutes. The person had eliminated at minimum 6 of his fighters. The person had done so from a position his teams could not locate and his teams could not reach. The person had done all of this alone. He sat with that. Then he got back on his radio and started reorganizing his formations because whoever was on that ridge was going to have to reload eventually. They were going to have to move eventually. And when they did, Zahir wanted every available barrel pointed at the eastern slope. It was a good plan. Sarah had already accounted for it. She had moved from her initial position 4 minutes earlier, not because she was compromised, but because staying in one place past a certain threshold was always a compromise in progress. And she had learned a long time ago to treat that threshold as a rule rather than a guideline. She was now 70 meters north and 12 meters lower on the ridgeline, in a secondary position she had identified during her initial survey. And she had a complete new set of range data built in her head because she had built it during the move. She keyed her radio. Alpha Actual, the eastern approach teams have been turned back. You have approximately a 4-minute window. Move your non-critical wounded to the secondary position I'm going to designate. Key twice if you copy. 2 keys. She gave him the coordinates in a format that required no map, compass, bearing, and pace distance, the most basic and reliable navigation language there is. Jason turned to Webb. New position, south-southwest, 120 meters. Move the wounded, go. Webb went. Jason stayed where he was on his radio looking at the sky. The overcast was thick and total, and the dark was the kind of dark that makes distance meaningless. Somewhere out there, 2 kilometers in a direction he could only approximately identify a single person, was holding 200 fighters in a posture of confused retreat. He thought about that. He had been a soldier for 6 years. He had done 3 tours. He had been in firefights that lasted minutes and firefights that lasted hours. He knew what a trained fighting force could do because he commanded one. And he knew with the particular certainty of someone who has spent years in violent places that what was happening on that ridge was something he did not have a category for. At midnight, exactly midnight, by the watch on his wrist, his radio crackled again. Alpha Actual, 3 RPG teams are consolidating on your northern approach. I'm going to address that in the next 2 minutes. When you hear the first shot, have your able-bodied men ready to return fire on the northern berm. Use the audio cover, 2 rounds per man, then back down. Acknowledge. Jason keyed twice. He went to his squad leaders. He said very quietly in the dark of the drainage channel, with wounded men breathing steadily on the southern end and 41 men on their knees in the dirt, 2 minutes. When you hear 1 shot from the ridge, 2 rounds north on the berm, and then down. Pass it. The message passed down the line in whispers. They waited. Jason looked at his watch. He looked at the northern berm. He breathed. 1 minute. He thought about Tyler. He thought about the last call, the one that had been cut short. He thought about the fact that Tyler didn't know where he was right now, didn't know what tonight had become, and he thought about how when this was over, he was going to call Tyler and he was going to give him grief about something stupid, something insignificant, the way brothers do when they're relieved but can't say it directly. He was going to get the chance to do that. He believed that now. 90 seconds. The shot from the ridge came at 1 minute and 53 seconds. Jason said, "Now, boss," and 41 rifles came up simultaneously over the northern berm, and for 4 seconds the channel was full of controlled noise, and then they went back down, and the northern RPG teams, already shaken, already disorganized from Sarah's first round, taking their lead man, scattered instead of consolidating. The moment passed. The channel was quiet again. Webb came back. "Wounded or moved?" "Good," Jason said. "Captain." Webb was looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite question and wasn't quite statement. "One person." Jason said, "Yeah." "How?" Jason didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, "Some people are just built for it." He paused. The right person in the right position at the right moment. He looked back up at the ridge. "That's not nothing. That's everything." Back at Fort Campbell, Tyler Brennan's phone buzzed again. It was 0017. "Davis," he answered immediately. "Your brother's company is intact," Davis said. "Situation is stabilizing. Reinforcements are now 80 minutes out, and the enemy formation is showing signs of fragmentation." Tyler let out a breath he had not known he was holding. It came out of him with a physical force, like something that had been compressed for hours, finally finding a release valve. "The asset," he said, when he could speak clearly, "is the asset. The asset is operational and uncompromised," Davis said. "One person," Tyler said. "You sent one person and they're—" He stopped. He couldn't complete the sentence because he didn't have the right word for what one person had apparently done to a 200-man assault force in under an hour. "Yes," Davis said. "Who are they?" The pause again. The selecting pause. "Someone who was at Fort Campbell tonight," Davis said. "Someone you've already met." The call ended. Tyler stood in the middle of the duty office corridor with the phone at his side, and he thought about that sentence, and the thinking moved through him like cold water, slow and total. "Someone you've already met at Fort Campbell tonight." His mind went back through the night. The bar, the squad, the jukebox, Pete behind the counter. The woman at the far end of the bar reading. The torn manual. The beer. The way she had walked out without looking back. He thought about the way she had looked at him when she finally looked up. Not with anger, not with fear, with the specific measuring quality of a scope finding a target. He thought about her saying, "I don't guess." He stood very still in the corridor. Deeks came around the corner and stopped when he saw Tyler's face. "What?" Deeks said. Tyler didn't answer right away. He was still working through it, the shape of what the night had been, the shape of what it was becoming, the particular and nauseating geometry of what he had done in that bar and who he had done it to and what that person was at this precise moment doing in the dark 2 continents away. "The asset," Tyler said very quietly. "I think I know who it is." Deeks waited. "I think," Tyler said, "we made a very serious mistake tonight." The word mistake hung in the corridor air between Tyler Brennan and Deeks like something physical, like something neither of them wanted to touch directly. Deeks had known Tyler for 4 years. He had seen him in firefights and field hospitals in the particular gray aftermath of operations that went wrong and operations that went right, and all the gradations in between. He had never seen Tyler look like this. Not frightened exactly. Something more interior than frightened. Something that a person feels when the ground they were standing on turns out to have been somebody else's floor. "Talk to me," Deeks said. "The bar," Tyler said. "Tonight, the woman at the bar." Deeks went still. "The supply clerk," Tyler said, and even as he said it, the phrase felt wrong in his mouth, felt like wearing a coat that doesn't fit. "Davis just told me the asset is someone I met tonight. At Fort Campbell." He looked at Deeks. "Who else was there that we didn't know?" Deeks opened his mouth, closed it. His face moved through several expressions rapidly, and then it landed on the one that Tyler recognized as the expression Deeks wore when something had genuinely gotten through to him, which was rare, and which looked like a man discovering an entirely new room in a house he thought he knew completely. "The woman who knew your shoulder," Deeks said slowly. "The woman who knew your rotation." "Yeah. The one you—" Deeks stopped. Yeah, Tyler said. The one I threw off her bar stool in front of 30 witnesses. The silence between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled because both people in it are processing the same information and arriving at the same destination from different directions. And she's, Deke started. In Helmand, right now, Tyler said, alone, doing whatever she's doing to 200 fighters so that my brother's company doesn't get wiped out. Deke sat down on the bench against the wall, not dramatically, just sat down because standing seemed suddenly inadequate for what his body was trying to process. He put both hands on his knees and looked at the floor and said nothing for almost 10 seconds, which was the longest Deeks had been silent in Tyler's memory. What do we do? Deke said. Tyler didn't answer, because there was nothing to do. His brother was in a ditch 8,000 miles away, and a woman Tyler Brennan had publicly humiliated 3 hours ago was the only thing standing between Jason and a body bag. And all Tyler could do was stand in a corridor at Fort Campbell and wait. And the waiting was a particular species of punishment he had not anticipated and felt he had not entirely not earned. He sat back down in the plastic chair. He looked at the clock. 0029. In Helmand Province, it was already tomorrow. 0100 Helmand Province. Zahir had stopped moving his men forward. This was not a decision he had made consciously or announced formally. It was the result of mathematics, the mathematics of loss. In the last 62 minutes, he had lost 11 fighters to fire he could not locate. Not artillery, not airstrikes, not a crew-served weapon. Single rounds precisely placed from a position that his 3 best scouts had attempted to identify and failed. The failure had cost 2 of the 3 scouts their lives, which had reduced the pool of men willing to volunteer for further reconnaissance missions considerably. He was sitting in this compound that served as his command position, which Sarah had ranged at 2,200 meters at 0113, and he was talking to his senior lieutenant, a man named Rasul, who had been with him for 6 years and who had the useful quality of saying things Zahir did not want to hear when those things needed to be said. It's one person, Rasul said. You don't know that. The shot pattern says it. The intervals say it. One shooter moving position between engagements. Single rounds, no follow-up fire from a second position. If it were a team, we would see overlap. We see none. Zahir said nothing. And the Americans in the channel are not pressing, Rasul continued. They return fire in short bursts coordinated with the shots from the ridge, then stop. They are conserving. They are waiting. If they had reinforcements, they would be using them. Then why aren't we advancing? Zahir said, and his voice carried the edge of a man who knows the answer and doesn't want to say it. Rasul looked at him steadily. Because 11 men are dead and we cannot find where the fire is coming from. The men are afraid. Not of the Americans in the channel, they have faced Americans before. They are afraid of what they cannot see. A pause. And fear you cannot explain is the most effective weapon there is. Zahir picked up his radio, put it down, picked it up again. One person, he said very quietly. An army of one person. Yes, Rasul said. Zahir sat with that. He was not a man given to awe. He had been fighting for 22 years, and he had seen things that stripped most forms of awe away and replaced them with calculation. But sitting in that compound in the dark, listening to the silence where his machine gun crew used to be, he felt something that was not quite awe, but lived in the same neighborhood. A recognition. The recognition that somewhere on the eastern ridge, in conditions that would have made most trained soldiers cautious, a single human being was methodically dismantling a 200-man operation with the patient deliberateness of someone who had never considered the possibility of failure. He keyed his radio. All units, consolidate on the western approach. Leave the northern and eastern sectors. We move to the channel from the west. The acknowledgments came back. He was adapting. That was the correct thing to do. Zahir was above everything else a man who adapted. Sarah heard the shift in movement before she confirmed it visually. The acoustic profile of the engagement. It changed. The sporadic fire from the north and east quieted, and there was a new compression of sound from the west that told her the enemy was reorganizing rather than retreating. She processed this in approximately 4 seconds, because 4 seconds was what it took, and she keyed her radio, 0114. Alpha Actual. They're consolidating west. New pressure on your western wall in approximately 3 minutes. Recommend you redistribute your able-bodied to the western berm now. 2 squad leaders on the west one, holding south in case they try to split. Key twice to confirm. Two keys came back immediately. Then Jason's voice, low and controlled. Can you cover the western approach from your current position? She considered the question for 1 second. Her current position had a partial sight line on the western approach, partial, not complete. The compound where Zahir was operating was at her 2 o'clock, 2,200 meters, and from there the western approach was a reasonable shot, but the angle was degraded by the ridge profile. Partially, she said. I'm going to need to move. Give me 4 minutes. Copy, Jason said. She was already moving. The move took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Because she was moving on terrain she had not pre-surveyed in darkness without a light source, and 340 was not slow for those conditions. It was by any objective measure extraordinarily fast. She reached the new position range 3 points on the western approach and confirmed the sightline. Alpha Actual, I'm set. Stand by. 0119. The western assault began at 0121, which was 2 minutes later than Sarah had estimated, which meant Zahir was moving deliberately rather than impulsively, which meant he was good. She noted this with a professional appreciation of someone who respects competence regardless of which side it's on. The lead element was 12 men moving in 2 columns with the kind of spacing that indicated proper training. They were using the natural ground features for cover, which was correct. They were moving in 3 to 5 second rushes, which was correct. They were, as far as she could determine, doing everything right. She put her crosshairs on the lead man of the right column. She breathed out. She fired. The right column stopped. She was already adjusting to the left column, and her second round came before the left column had fully processed what had happened to the right, and the left column stopped also. And for a moment, 3, maybe 4 seconds, both columns were completely still, which was the wrong response. But the human one, the response that happens when the brain is receiving information it cannot immediately categorize. In those 4 seconds, she ranged the position she had identified as the likely location of the column's rear security. Her third round found it. The western assault did not break. It stalled, which is a different thing. A braking force turns and runs. A stalled force goes to ground and reassesses, which is what Zahir's men did, and which was tactically sound, and which bought Jason's men approximately 6 minutes before the next push. Jason used those 6 minutes. He reorganized his western berm, moved his 2 best marksmen to anchor positions, and sent Webb with 4 men to reinforce the southern wall, because if he were Zahir, the western push was a probe, and the real assault was coming from the south when the western defense committed. Webb said, "You think he's trying to split us?" "I think he's smart," Jason said. "Smart commanders probe before they commit." "So do we adjust the western wall or hold it?" "We hold it, and we wait for her to tell us something has changed." Webb looked at him. "You trust her that much? You don't even know who she is." Jason thought about that for half a second. He thought about the machine gun that had been silencing his first and second squad for an hour before it went quiet without explanation. He thought about the RPG teams that had pulled back and not returned. He thought about 11 enemy fighters who had been actively fighting 60 minutes ago and were not fighting now. "I trust what she's done," Jason said. "That's enough." 0131. Sarah had been on the ridge for 92 minutes. She had fired 21 rounds. Of those 21, 19 had achieved their intended effect, which was a percentage she did not consciously think about, because thinking about percentages was something you did in debrief, not in the field. In the field, you thought about the next shot, only the next shot. Her water supply was half gone. Her cold weather layer was working, but the ridge was exposed and the temperature had dropped since insertion. Her left hand, which she used to support the rifle's forestock, had a particular kind of numbness in the middle 2 fingers that she recognized as the first stage of performance degradation, and which she was managing by rotating grip pressure every 4 minutes in a cycle she had developed during cold weather training in Alaska 3 years earlier. She was, by any clinical assessment, operating at the outer edge of sustainable parameters. She was also, by the same assessment, completely functional. Zahir keyed his radio at 0133 and said, "Status on the southern approach." The response, no movement. "Western assault is pinned. Pull back the western element. Do not expose them further. Commander, we have twice their numbers. We have twice their numbers, and we are pinned by fire we cannot counter," Zahir said, and his voice had the flat finality of a man who has made a decision and is not discussing it. "Pull back. We regroup." A pause, then, "Yes, Commander." Rasul, sitting beside him, said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are we going to do?" Zahir looked at his radio. "We are going to find that position. I don't care how long it takes. And if we can't..." Zahir didn't answer immediately. He looked at the eastern ridgeline, invisible in the dark, and thought about the person he could not see, and could not find, and could not stop, and he said in a voice that was quieter than his normal register, "Then we already lost. We just haven't admitted it yet." 0144. Sarah had not moved from her tertiary position in 23 minutes. She was due to move. Her internal protocol was 18-minute maximum occupancy on any fixed position. But the Western Assault's pullback had created a momentary stillness in the enemy formation that she was using to assess and recalibrate rather than burn movement time that might be needed later. Her radio crackled. Davis's voice, Phantom 5. "Reinforcement timeline has moved. ETA now 51 minutes. How is the tactical picture?" "Enemy is in reorganization phase," she said. "They have pulled back from Western approach. I estimate they have one more push in them before the formation starts to fragment genuinely. They'll probably try a split, this time west and south simultaneously, to divide the defensive response." "Can you cover a split approach?" She considered. "Partially. If they split effectively, I'll prioritize the southern element because the western berm has more depth. I'll need Alpha's squad leaders to understand they're going to have to hold the western wall independently for approximately 60 to 90 seconds while I address the south. I'll relay that." "Sir," she paused, "the enemy commander is good. He's adapting faster than most. If he figures out the position before reinforcements arrive, then we trust you to have already moved," Davis said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes, sir. 51 minutes, Phantom 5. "Copy." She clicked off. She looked out over the valley. 51 minutes. She had been here 95 minutes already. The math was not comfortable, but math rarely was in this kind of work. You did not do this job because the math was comfortable. You did it because the math on the other side of uncomfortable was 48 people alive instead of dead, and that math was the only one that mattered. 0152. Tyler Brennan had not left the plastic chair. He had been in it with minor positional adjustments for nearly 2 hours. Deeks had gone to get coffee at some point and returned with 2 cups and set one beside Tyler without speaking, and Tyler had drunk about a third of it and forgotten the rest. Ferris came out of his office at 0154 with his tablet and his unreadable expression and stopped in front of Tyler. "Reinforcements are 53 minutes out," he said. "Asset on station is still operational. Enemy formation appears to be in partial retreat." Tyler looked up. "Partial. Still some engagement, but the pressure on Alpha's position has decreased significantly in the last 30 minutes. Tyler processed this. "Because of the asset." Ferris met his eyes. "Apparently." "One person," Tyler said, "not for the first time tonight. But this time the words came out differently, not with disbelief, not with the professional skepticism that had colored them earlier. They came out with the tone of a verdict. One person changed the entire battle." Ferris said nothing. He was a good officer, and good officers understand when a silence is doing more work than words would. Tyler looked at the coffee cup in his hands. "Sir, do you know who it is, the asset?" Ferris studied him for a moment. "Why do you ask?" "Because Davis told me it's someone I've met tonight at Fort Campbell." He paused. "And I want to know, I need to know if I'm right about who I think it is." Ferris held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, "I don't have access to that classification level, Sergeant. I genuinely don't know." Another pause. "But if you're right about what you think you know, I'd suggest you spend the next 53 minutes thinking very carefully about what that means." He went back into his office. Tyler sat with that. Deeks leaned over. "What does that mean?" "It means he's not denying it," Tyler said quietly. 0203, Helmand Province. Zahir's second push came at 0203, and it was exactly what Sarah had predicted to Davis: simultaneous western and southern pressure, 12 men on each approach, with the obvious intent of dividing the defensive response and creating a gap that the reserve element could exploit. She saw the southern element moving at 0204. She keyed her radio. "Alpha actual. Southern element is moving now. I'm addressing south. Western berm holds independently. 60 seconds. "Copy," Jason said. His voice was tight but controlled. She shifted her entire focus south. The southern element was moving faster than the western had, which told her they had been briefed that the first assault had been slowed by fire from the ridge, and they needed to close distance quickly. Speed and cover are competing values in an assault, and they had chosen speed, which meant they were exposed for more of the approach than their predecessors had been. She used that. Her first round went into the southern element at 0205. Her second at 0205 in 11 seconds. Her third at 0205 in 24 seconds. The intervals were precise and rhythmic, and they had an effect on the element that went beyond the physical casualties, the sound of a rifle firing at 13-second intervals in the dark with no visible source and no answering fire. Has a particular psychological weight that training prepares soldiers for intellectually, but does not fully prepare them for experientially. The southern element went to ground at 0205 in 40 seconds. She shifted west. The western element had advanced 30 meters in the 60 seconds she had been addressing south. Good progress disciplined, but they were now in her primary sight line on the western approach, and she had 3 range points already set for this exact position. Her 4th round of this sequence stopped the western element's lead man. Her 5th round 8 seconds later hit the radio operator at the rear of the western column, which was a priority target she had identified during the original western assault and had not been able to reach from her previous position. The radio operator going down meant the western element lost direct coordination with Zahir for approximately 90 seconds while the backup radio was located and activated 90 seconds in which Jason's western berm was able to reestablish its positions without incoming pressure. 0207. The southern element had not broken. They were on the ground, but they were not retreating. Their lead, a capable man whose tactical discipline Sarah had noted across the last 20 minutes of observation, was reorganizing them from a prone position using hand signals that she could not see from 2 kilometers, but whose effects she could read in the pattern of movement. She had 2 rounds remaining before she needed to reload. She used one of them. The reorganization stopped. She reloaded with the practice speed of 10,000 repetitions, which took 4 seconds, and she was back on the southern element before they had fully processed the interruption. Alpha Actual, she said into the radio. Her voice was completely level. Southern element is stalled. Western element has lost radio coordination temporarily. This is your best window in the last hour. I need your squad leaders to make noise, not advance. Just fire on both approaches simultaneously for 30 seconds. Give the enemy something to think about other than their own reorganization. A brief pause. Then Jason, 30 seconds of fire both approaches. 30 seconds, starting on my mark. She ranged the compound at 2,200 meters. If Zahir was there, and she believed he was based on radio traffic patterns she had been tracking for 90 minutes, the coordinated noise from the channel would draw his attention at exactly the moment she wanted it drawn. Mark! The channel erupted. Not chaotically, Jason's squad leaders were professionals, and 30 seconds of coordinated fire from 40 rifles sounds different from a panicked response. Sounds organized. Sounds like a force that has just decided to stop absorbing pressure and start returning it. And that sound moved through Zahir's 2 assault elements like a current disrupting the reorganization, triggering the instinctive response of going deeper into cover rather than advancing. And in those 30 seconds, while every element of Zahir's force was focused on the noise coming from the channels, Sarah made a decision she had been building toward for 20 minutes. She shifted her angle to 2,200 meters. She found the compound. She found the window of light, small, partially covered but present, that she had identified as Zahir's likely position 40 minutes ago, based on the pattern of radio transmissions and the logic of where a commander would position himself relative to his assault elements. She breathed. She fired. The radio traffic from Zahir's command element stopped at 0209 in 14 seconds, and it did not resume for 4 minutes and 31 seconds, which was long enough for both assault elements to lose their coordination. Anchor long enough for the western element to begin a disorganized pullback, long enough for the southern element already stalled, already shaken, now without command guidance to make the individual decisions that soldiers make. When the structure above them goes silent, they went to ground and stayed there. 0214. Jason's radio crackled. Alpha Actual, Sarah's voice, still level, still unhurried. Enemy command element appears to be disrupted. Both assault elements are stalled. I assess this is your lowest pressure window of the engagement. Recommend you use it to consolidate your wounded into the primary extraction zone. Reinforcements are 37 minutes out. Jason turned to Webb. Primary extraction zone. Move the wounded. All of them. Now. Webb was already moving. Jason keyed his radio. Friendly asset. I need to ask you something. A pause. Go ahead. Are you alone out there? The answer took 2 seconds, which was not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was at that precise moment scanning the ridge below her position for movement, and she finished the scan before she responded. Yes, she said. Jason sat with that word for a moment. He had believed it for the last hour and a half, had believed it from the evidence of the shot pattern and the radio timing and the movement of the enemy formation in response to fire it could never locate. Believing it and hearing it confirmed where it turned out different experiences. Hearing it confirmed put something in his chest that he did not have a clean word for. It was close to awe, close to gratitude. But it was bigger than both of those things, and it carried the specific weight of knowing that a person he would never see, a person whose name he did not know, had made a choice to stand between his men and the dark. Copy, he said, because he was a soldier, and soldiers say copy when words fail them. 37 minutes, she said. Hold your position. We'll hold, Jason said. 0221. Sarah drank the last of her water. She had been on the ridge for 102 minutes. Her left hand had progressed to the second stage of cold degradation, which affected her grip stability by an amount she could calculate and compensate for. She had compensated. Her firing position had moved 5 times since insertion. She had covered, by her estimate, approximately 400 meters of ridgeline terrain in the dark, which was close to the maximum she would have planned for a single operator night mission of this duration. She was by any measure at the edge of her operational envelope. She filed that information and set it aside because the edge of the envelope was not outside the envelope, and outside the envelope was the only threshold that mattered. Zahir's radio traffic resumed at 0219. Reduced, ragged. The voice on the command frequency was not Zahir's, it was Rasul's. And Rasul's voice had in it the particular quality of a man managing a situation that has gone beyond what he prepared for. He was issuing orders, but they were consolidation orders, pulling elements back, accounting for casualties, the operational vocabulary of a force that has not broken, but has recognized, with the clarity that only comes from sustained and inexplicable failure, that the night has not gone in the direction it was supposed to go. Sarah listened to the traffic for 90 seconds. She assessed. She made a calculation that was partly tactical and partly something older and more instinctive than tactics. The calculation of a predator, reading the state of a prey, reading not what the prey is doing, but what it is about to decide. They were not going to push again. Not tonight. Not with 37 minutes remaining in a ridge they could not clear, in a channel full of American rifles that had just shown they were willing to use them, in command traffic that had gone silent for 4 minutes and 20 of their men on the ground. They were going to wait. And waiting in this context was the same as losing, because in 37 minutes there would be nothing left to wait for. She keyed her brain. Command, this is Phantom 5. I assess the enemy formation has shifted to a defensive posture. No further offensive push expected before reinforcements arrive. I'm going to maintain position and monitor. Davis's voice. Copy Phantom 5. Outstanding work. She did not respond to that because she never did, because outstanding work was a description of what had already happened, and what had already happened was not what she was thinking about. She was thinking about the next 29 minutes and the temperature of her left hand and the movement in the far northern sector that might be a withdrawal element or might be a probe. And she ranged it at 1,400 meters and watched it and determined it was a withdrawal element and tracked it until it was out of range and then scanned the ridge below her once more. At Fort Campbell, Tyler Brennan looked at the clock. 0226. His phone buzzed. Davis. Your brother's company is intact, Davis said without preamble. Enemy force is in defensive consolidation. Reinforcements are 31 minutes from station. The situation is resolved. Tyler pressed his hand flat against the wall to his left because he needed the wall and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He felt the cold pain against his palm and he breathed once, twice, and he said, "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Davis said. Tyler understood what that meant. He stood in the corridor of the duty office at Fort Campbell at 0226 in the morning, And he thought about a woman reading a field manual at the end of a bar, and a field manual torn in half and beer poured over the pieces and eyes that held no fear whatsoever. And he thought she knew. She looked at me, and she already knew what she was. She didn't need me to know it. She didn't need anyone to know it. She just needed to be left alone to do it. Deeks appeared at his shoulder. "What? Jason's alive," Tyler said. "All 48. Deeks exhaled hard through his nose and leaned against the wall and tipped his head back and said something quiet at the ceiling that wasn't quite a word. Tyler looked at his hands. They were shaking. Not much. Just enough to notice if you were looking for it, which he was. "She held them," Tyler said, "alone, for over an hour and a half, against 200 fighters. He paused. "And 3 hours ago, I threw her off a bar stool and told her she didn't belong." Deeks said nothing. "What kind of man does that?" Tyler said. Not asking Deeks, asking the corridor, the clock, the specific and unforgiving geometry of a night that had decided to teach him something he had not signed up to learn. The clock read 0228. 29 minutes to reinforcements. On the ridge, Sarah Kincaid settled. Her breathing steadied her grip and kept watch over a valley full of frightened men who had spent the last 109 minutes trying to find her and failed completely. She watched. She waited. She was very, very good at both. 29 minutes. That was what remained between Jason Brennan's company and the reinforcements that would end the night. 29 minutes sounds like nothing until you are the one counting them in a drainage ditch in Helmand Province with 7 wounded men and 41 rifles and a ridge you cannot see and a radio frequency you are not supposed to have listening for a voice that has been the only reliable thing about the last 2 hours of your life. Jason was not counting seconds. He had learned a long time ago that counting seconds makes time slower, and slower is the enemy of composure. And composure was what his men needed from him right now, more than ammunition or cover or anything else. They needed to look at their captain and see a man who believed the next 29 minutes were survivable, so he gave them that. He moved along the channel wall with a steadiness he did not entirely feel, checking positions, checking wounded, saying the things that needed to be said in the tone that made them land correctly. "Martinez, how's your breathing?" "Good, sir, I'm good." "Kowalski, that arm needs to stay elevated." "Higher." "Yes, sir." "Webb." He stopped beside his staff sergeant at the Western Berm. "Status. Western element has not moved in 11 minutes, Webb said. Southern element is static. We have 1 man with a round at his thigh that is going to need surgery in the next 3 hours, 2 with concussion-grade blast exposure, 4 others walking wounded. Nobody critical in the immediate sense." "Nobody critical," Jason repeated. "Not yet, sir." Jason nodded. He looked at the Western Berm, the dirt wall, the rifles pointed over it, the faces of men who had been in this ditch for 2 hours and 17 minutes, and who were tired in the deep cellular way that only sustained high-stress situations produce, where the body burns through its reserves so completely that what remains is something purer than adrenaline, something closer to will. 27 minutes, he said. "We hold for 27 minutes and this night is done." Nobody cheered. Rangers don't cheer for things that haven't happened yet. But something moved through the channel, a collective adjustment of posture, a tightening, a collective decision to spend what remained of their energy on the next 27 minutes rather than on anything that had already happened. Jason went back to his radio. 0231, Fort Campbell. Tyler Brennan had left the plastic chair. He was standing in the parking lot behind the duty office in the cold October air, with his jacket open because the cold felt necessary, felt like something his body needed to cut through the particular fog of the last 2.5 hours. Deeks was inside. Tyler was outside. He needed the distance. He had his phone in his hand and he was looking at it, not because he expected a call, but because holding it was something to do with his hands, while his mind did what it was doing, which was assembling and reassembling the same pieces of the same night in different configurations, trying to arrive at a version of events that made him feel less like who he currently felt he was. There was no such version. He had seen something in Sarah Kincaid within the first 90 seconds of noticing her. He had seen the stillness. He had seen the way she read, not the performing of reading that people do in public spaces to signal intelligence, but the actual absorption of a person for whom the text is the only thing in the room. He had seen the way she clocked his shoulder, his scar, his rotation schedule, with the speed and accuracy of a targeting system that had been running quietly in the background the entire time waiting for a reason to surface. He had seen all of that, and he had torn her manual in half anyway. He put his phone in his pocket, he put his hands at his sides, he stood into the parking lot in the cold, and he let the full weight of the night sit on him without trying to shift it, because shifting it was what people did when they didn't want to learn what the weight was teaching. And Tyler Brennan, whatever his failures tonight, was not the kind of man who refused to be taught. He stayed outside for 6 more minutes. Then he went back in. 0238 Helmand Province. Sarah heard the movement at 0238, which was 21 minutes before reinforcements, and approximately 43 minutes after the enemy formation had shifted to what she had assessed as a defensive posture. She had been wrong about the defensive posture. Not entirely wrong, the main body of Zahir's force was consolidated and not advancing. But Zahir, or whoever was now running Zahir's operation, had detached a small element, 4 men from the northern withdrawal group. The element was moving quietly, using a route that kept them in a dead ground, feature a shallow ravine running north to south on the western face of the ridge that Sarah had identified during her initial terrain survey, but had not been able to fully observe from any of her 5 positions. She heard them because one of them dislodged a stone at 0237 in 51 seconds, and the sound of it, specific directional, inconsistent with wind or animal movement, registered in the part of her brain that never entirely stopped processing audio input even when the rest of her was focused on the valley below. She was already moving before she finished identifying what she had heard. The dead ground ravine emerged onto the ridge line approximately 30 meters north of her current position, which meant the 4-man element, if they maintained their current pace and direction, would crest the ridge in approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds. In 4 minutes and 20 seconds, they would know within a 30-meter radius exactly where she was. She moved south, fast, not running on ridgeline terrain in the dark without a light source. It's how you break an ankle or worse, but moving with the compressed urgency of someone who has precise information about how much time they have and is using every second of it. 20 seconds of movement. Stop. Listen. They were still in the ravine, still climbing. 3 minutes 40, she moved again. Her new position was 60 meters south of where she had been, which gave her an angle on the ravine's crest that was workable but not ideal. She was firing at an upward angle now rather than level, which changed the ballistic calculation, and she ran the adjustment in her head while she was still moving because there was not going to be time to do it once she stopped. She stopped. She settled. She found the crest of the ravine in her scope. 0242. The first man came over the ridge at 0242 and 14 seconds. He was moving carefully, a rifle up, scanning, left first and then right, with the discipline of a man who understood he was in a sniper's environment and was trying to behave accordingly. Sarah fired at 0242 and 19 seconds, which was 5 seconds after he crested, which was the time it took her to confirm the target and settle the shot at an angle and distance she had not pre-ranged. The second man came over at 0242 and 31 seconds. He had heard the suppressed shot, not the report she was running a suppressor, but the mechanical sound of the action cycling, which at this range was audible to a man who was listening for exactly that kind of sound. He went left, which was the tactically correct response. She had already adjusted left. The third and fourth men did not crest the ridge. She heard them go back down into the ravine, moving faster than they had come up, and the sound of their retreat faded into the general noise of the valley below. And then there was silence on the ridgeline, and Sarah held her position and scanned for 45 seconds and confirmed nothing was moving toward her, and then she breathed. Her heart rate, which she was aware of the way a pilot is aware of instrument readings constantly, peripherally without fixating, had elevated during the movement and the engagement, and was now returning to a number she considered acceptable. She gave it 90 seconds. Then she keyed her radio. Command, minor ridge incursion, northern approach. Addressed, no compromise. Davis's voice came back immediately, which told her he had been waiting. Copy Phantom 5. You have 16 minutes to reinforcements. Can you hold? Yes, she said. There was no version of the next 16 minutes in which that answer changed. 0244 Fort Campbell. The duty office phone rang at 0244, and Ferris answered it and spoke for approximately 90 seconds, and then came to the door and looked at Tyler Brennan, who was back in the plastic chair, and said, Reinforcements are 15 minutes out. Your brother's company is intact. The asset, he paused and the pause carried weight, addressed a ridge incursion 2 minutes ago and remains operational. Tyler looked up. Ridge incursion. Affirmative. That means someone got close to her. Ferris held his gaze. It appears so, and she addressed it. Affirmative. Tyler looked at the floor. He thought about 4 men climbing a ridge in the dark toward a position they were trying to locate, and a woman who had been operating alone for over 2 hours in the cold with her supply of water gone, and her left hand in whatever condition 2+ hours of cold weather shooting produced, and who had not only detected the approach but moved and engaged and resolved it, and then called it in with the tonal register of someone reporting a minor administrative issue. 15 minutes, Tyler said. 15 minutes, Ferris confirmed. Tyler nodded once. He did not speak again. 0249, Helmand Province. Rasul, who was now the senior functioning commander of what remained of Zahir's operation, was on his radio doing the mathematics of the night. The mathematics were not good. They had lost by his count 23 men confirmed. An additional 14 were wounded to varying degrees of severity. The 4-man ridge element had returned to report 2 of their number down, and the position still unlocated. His remaining force was consolidated in the western approach, which was the only sector where he had maintained any coherent unit structure, and that force was not advancing. He was also aware, with the clarity that comes from being a practical man in an impractical situation, that the reason his force was not advancing was not tactical limitation. They had the numbers, they had the weapons. What they did not have was the will to walk into fire they could not see from a position they could not find, and will is not something you can order into existence once it has been spent. He keyed his radio and said, "All elements, we are withdrawing to the secondary positions. This engagement is over." The acknowledgments came back without protest, which told him everything he needed to know about the state of his men. He stood up. He looked at the eastern ridge, invisible, dark, silent except for the wind. He thought about whoever was up there and what they had done tonight and how they had done it, and he said something quiet in Pashto that was not a curse and not a prayer, but somewhere between the two, the acknowledgement of a man who has met something he did not expect and will not forget. Then he walked west and his men followed, and the valley began to empty. 0253. Sarah saw the withdrawal begin. She had been expecting it. The radio traffic had shifted to consolidation frequencies at 0248, and the movement patterns she could observe from the ridge confirmed what the radio was suggesting. But seeing it happen had a specific quality that she had never found a clean way to describe. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was more like the completion of an equation. The answer arriving after a long calculation, and the answer being the one you needed rather than the one you feared. She watched the western approach, which had been the most active sector for the last 45 minutes, begin to thin. Men moving back, not forward. The specific body language of withdrawal, even at distance, even in the dark, has a signature that is unmistakable once you have seen it enough times. She keyed her radio. Alpha Actual. Enemy is withdrawing from all sectors. Western approach is clearing. I assess you are no longer under active offensive threat. 12 minutes to reinforcements. Recommend you stand your perimeter until they arrive. Do not pursue. Jason's voice. Copy. No pursuit. A brief pause. Are you... He stopped. Started again. What is your status? She considered the question. Her left hand had progressed to stage 3, cold degradation, which meant she was compensating significantly for grip loss, and the compensation itself was creating fatigue in her forearm that would become a limitation inside the next 20 minutes. She had 0 water remaining. She had been on the ridge for 134 minutes. She had fired, by her count, 31 rounds. Operational, she said. Another pause from Jason's end. She could hear something in the quality of his silence. Not radio static, something more personal than that, something that a person carries in their breathing when they are feeling something they don't have the immediate language for. Thank you, he said, not as a formality, not as radio protocol, as something a man says when he has run out of other words for what he means. She said, hold your position, because that was what needed to be said, and she was not good at the other kind of thing. And they both knew that what had happened tonight was not something that resolved itself in the space of a radio exchange anyway. 0302. The reinforcements arrived at 0302, which was 5 minutes earlier than the updated ET, Tom, because the flight crews had pushed their airspeed into a range they were not supposed to sustain for extended periods, and had done it anyway because the nature of the situation had been communicated to them clearly enough that they understood what 5 minutes represented in human terms. Jason heard the rotors before he saw the lights and the sound of them. The specific acoustic signature of American military helicopters coming in from the east produced a reaction in the drainage channel that was unlike anything he had seen in 3 tours of service. Not cheering exactly. More like a collective exhale from 48 men who had been holding their breath in shifts for 2 hours and 23 minutes. And the exhale had in it relief and exhaustion, and something that was very close to grief, because when you survive something that should have killed you, the first feeling is not triumph. It is something quieter and more complicated. It is the weight of the distance between what happened and what almost happened. Webb appeared beside him. "They're coming in on the eastern pad." "I know," Jason said. "We've got to get the wounded loaded first." "I know, Webb." Webb looked at him. "Captain, you okay?" Jason thought about that question for a moment. He looked at the eastern ridgeline, which was still dark, still silent. Somewhere up there, a person he had never seen was watching the helicopters come in and doing whatever she did in the private interior of a mind like hers, and he had no way to reach her and no way to thank her in any way that was proportionate to what she had done. "I'm fine," he said. "Get the wounded loaded." 0309. Sarah watched the helicopters land from the ridge. She watched the wounded loaded first, then the rest of the company in organized sequence. She watched the channel empty over the course of 7 minutes, and she watched the helicopters lift and move east, and she watched until their lights were indistinguishable from stars. And then there was nothing in the valley below except the darkness and the settling quiet of a place where something enormous had happened and was now over. She had been on the ridge for 150 minutes. She disassembled the rifle. She packed the kit. She checked her sidearm. She took her bearings for the extraction point, which was the dry riverbed where she had landed 2 kilometers east, and she began to move. The walk took 38 minutes because the terrain was rough and the dark was total, and she was tired in a way she did not acknowledge to herself until she was moving. And the sustained stillness of the last 2.5 hours resolved into motion, and the motion let her body report what it had been holding back. Her left hand hurt. Her right knee, which had an old ligament issue that flared in cold weather, was reporting its presence with the insistence of something that had been ignored for too long. Her back carried the weight of the kit and the hours in the same position, with a dull, comprehensive ache that she filed as background information. She walked. At 0347, she reached the extraction point. The vehicle was there. Davis was not. He had sent a driver, which was correct because Davis understood that after an operation of this duration and intensity, a debrief was not what was needed. What was needed was water warmth and the particular silence of a person who has been alone with something enormous and needs the space to put it down slowly rather than all at once. The driver handed her a water bottle without speaking. She drank half of it immediately, which was too fast, and made herself slow down for the second half. She got into the vehicle. She looked out the window at the dark as they drove. She thought about nothing specific. She was not built for the kind of retrospective emotional processing that other people did, automatically the replaying the feeling through the narration of events to yourself as a way of integrating them. She processed differently. She would know what tonight meant in about 3 days when it surfaced in a dream or in the quality of a particular silence or in the way she held a cup of coffee and found herself looking at a middle distance without knowing what she was looking at. Tonight she was just tired and 31 rounds lighter, and the reason 48 people were going to call someone tomorrow who would be glad to hear from them. 0319 Fort Campbell. The call came to Tyler Brennan at 0319. Jason's voice on the other end, and Tyler had pressed the phone so hard against his ear that the edge left a mark on his jaw. And he said, "Hey." And Jason said, "Ho." "Hey." And for about 4 seconds, neither of them said anything else because neither of them needed to. "You good?" Tyler said finally. "I'm good," Jason said. "I'm on a helicopter. 7 wounded, none critical. Everyone else is walking. Everyone. Everyone." Tyler put his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling of the corridor and breathed. He breathed for a long time longer than breathing required until the thing behind his sternum that had been compressed for 3.5 hours began to ease. "Jason," he said. "Yeah." The asset they sent, the one who, he stopped, started again. Did you know who it was? Did you get a name? A pause from Jason's end. The rotor noise behind him. No, never got a name. She never gave one. But it was one person. One person, Jason confirmed, and his voice had a quality in it that Tyler recognized as the voice of a man who has seen something that exceeded his existing categories and is still in the early stage of building new ones. One person for the whole thing, start to finish. Tyler closed his eyes. I know who it was, he said quietly. What? I know who she is. He opened his eyes. I can't tell you right now, but when you get back, when you debrief, ask them. Ask who Phantom 5 is. A long pause. Phantom 5, Jason repeated. Yeah. You know her. Tyler thought about that for a moment. He thought about what knowing means, whether having torn someone's field manual in half and thrown them off a bar stool constituted knowing them, whether standing on the wrong side of an equation for an entire night and only understanding it from the outside counts as knowledge. I thought I did, he said. I was wrong about basically everything. Jason was quiet for a moment. The rotors, the wind. Tyler, what did you do? It was the question, and Tyler knew it was the question, and he had known since 0029 that it was coming, and he had been thinking about the answer for the last 3 hours, and the answer he had arrived at was the only honest one available to him. Something I can't undo, he said. Something I'm going to have to find a way to live with. Jason didn't respond to that. He understood his brother well enough to know when a thing needed to be said and then left alone, and this was one of those things. I'll be back day after tomorrow, Jason said. We'll talk. Yeah, Tyler said. We will. The call ended. Tyler stood into the corridor. Deeks had fallen asleep on the bench against the wall. Genuinely asleep, sitting up, head back, in the way that combat soldiers sleep when sleep becomes available completely and without transition. Tyler looked at him for a moment and then looked away. He thought about Sarah Kincaid driving back from wherever she was coming from in the dark alone, with 31 rounds spent and 150 minutes of ridge behind her, and not a single person in the vehicle who understood what she had just done or what it had cost her to do it. He thought about the $20 bill she had left on the bar for Pete's trouble. He thought about the way she had buttoned the top button of her jacket before she walked out of Murphy's Tavern, that small, precise, self-contained gesture that he now understood was not composure adopted for the room, but composure that was simply native to her, the natural state of a person who had spent years being exactly who she was, in spaces that had no frame for it. He sat back down in the plastic chair. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Not full dawn yet, not even close, but the particular dark blue that comes before gray, the color of a night that has decided it is finished. 0351. Sarah's vehicle crossed back onto the Fort Campbell perimeter at 0351. The base was quiet in the way that bases are quiet at 4 in the morning, not empty, never empty, but reduced to its essential frequencies. The duty shifts, the perimeter patrols, the particular hum of an institution that never fully sleeps but breathes differently in the pre-dawn hours. The driver pulled up to the building Sarah had designated, which was not the administrative block and not the barracks, but a third location that existed on base maps under a designation that meant nothing to anyone without the clearance level to decode it. She got out, she took her kit, she told the driver she was done with him for the night. She went inside. She put the kit down on the table she had built her loadout on. Was it only 5 hours ago? It felt geological, like something that had happened in a different era, and she sat in the chair beside it and looked at her left hand. The numbness had resolved into a deep, comprehensive ache. She flexed the fingers one by one, slowly assessing the range of motion, confirming that the degradation had not progressed to the point where there was structural damage. There wasn't. There was damage of the temporary kind, the kind that sleep and warmth and time would address, and she filed that assessment and set it aside. She looked at the wall. She thought about Jason Brennan's voice on the radio saying thank you in the way that meant something more than thank you. She thought about 48 men who were on helicopters right now instead of in the ground. She thought about none of the other things. Not the bar, not Tyler Brennan, not the beer-soaked manual. None of that was relevant to what had happened on the ridge, and what had happened on the ridge was the only thing she had the energy left to carry. She sat in the chair. After a while, she leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She was asleep in less than a minute. In the valley in Helmand province, the sky was beginning to lighten. The drainage channel was empty. The firebase was beginning the complicated process of accounting for a night that had not gone the way anyone on either side had planned. The western approach where Zahir's men had pushed and stalled and pulled back showed the marks of the engagement in the way that ground always shows the marks of what has happened on it. On the eastern ridge there was nothing. No brass, no equipment, no indication that anyone had been there at all. She had policed everything. She always did. The ridge was empty and clean, and the wind moved across it in the early morning, the way wind moves across any ridge, indifferent, continuous with no memory of what it had moved through the night before. But the valley below it was different than it had been at sunset, and 48 men were alive. And those two facts were connected by a single thread, invisible as the wind running from the eastern ridge to the drainage channel and back again, held in place by 31 rounds in 150 minutes, and a woman whose name nobody in that valley would ever know. She slept for 4 hours and 11 minutes, which was not enough, and was exactly what the next 4 hours permitted. She woke without an alarm because she had never needed one. Her internal clock was one of those things about her that other people found unsettling when they discovered it, the way they found most things about her unsettling when they discovered them. She woke, assessed her left hand, flexed it 3 times, determined the ache had reduced to a manageable level, and got up. It was 0 at 804 minutes at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Outside the base was fully alive, the sounds of a military installation running its morning routines. Formations calling cadence somewhere in the middle distance, vehicles moving on the service roads. The world going about its business as though the night had been ordinary. For most people on this base, it had been. Sarah washed her face, changed into a fresh duty uniform, and stood in front of the small mirror long enough to confirm that nothing on her face reported what the last 6 hours had contained. Nothing did. She had that quality, the face that reset completely between events, that held no residue. Some people spent years learning to do that. For Sarah, it had always been simply how she was made. She picked up her phone. 3 missed calls, all from a number she recognized as Davis's secondary line, which meant the debrief had been scheduled and the timeline was not optional. She called back. Davis answered on the first ring. 0900, my office, bring nothing. Yes, sir, she said. The call ended. She had 53 minutes. She spent 12 of them eating a meal that she approached with the same systematic practicality she applied to everything, because her body had burned through an enormous reserve in the last 6 hours, and the reserve needed to be rebuilt, regardless of whether she felt like eating, and she did not particularly feel like eating. She ate anyway. At 0857, she was outside Davis's office. At 0900 exactly, he opened the door. The debrief lasted 41 minutes. Davis ran it himself, no other personnel, which told her 2 things. The classification level of the operation was high enough that the standard debrief structure didn't apply, and Davis was managing something beyond the tactical outcome that he had not yet told her about. She answered his questions with the precision he expected and the brevity he preferred. 31 rounds fired, 19 confirmed eliminations. 12 additional fighters assessed as wounded or suppressed. 0 friendly casualties attributable to the engagement window. Enemy force in full withdrawal at 0302. Davis wrote nothing down. He never did in these sessions. His memory for operational detail was one of the things that had made him exceptional at his job for 30 years. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the official count from the valley came in at 0700. She waited. 97, he said. Enemy combatants eliminated or mortally wounded during the engagement window, accounting for the withdrawal element that was tracked by satellite until 0415. He looked at her steadily. 97. Sarah said nothing. She had known the number would be higher than her direct count. She had known from the chaos she had introduced into the enemy formation that the secondary effects, the friendly fire incidents caused by panicked withdrawal in the dark, the men lost in the terrain during disorganized retreat, would add to the total. She had known this and had used it deliberately as a force multiplier. Knowing it and hearing the number stated out loud were still, in a small and specific way, different experiences. The Rangers, she said, all 48 alive, 7 wounded, all expected to make full recovery. A pause. Captain Brennan specifically asked through his debrief officer to know the identity of the asset. He was denied per protocol. Good, she said. Davis looked at her for a moment. There's something else. She waited. Sergeant Tyler Brennan submitted a formal request at 0600 this morning. He requested a meeting with the commanding officer of whatever unit was responsible for last night's asset for the purpose of delivering a formal apology. Davis paused. He also submitted an incident report on his own conduct at Murphy's Tavern last night, self-reported, unprompted. Sarah was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, that was his choice to make. Yes, Davis said, it was. He studied her. He knows it was you. He figured it out last night before the reinforcements arrived. I know, Sarah said. Davis raised an eyebrow, just slightly. You know, he's not stupid, she said. He's careless. Those are different things. She paused. He saw what he needed to see when he looked at me last night. He chose not to see anything else. That was carelessness. Once the context changed, he would have put it together. He's a ranger. They don't stay wrong once they have enough information. Davis looked at her for a long moment. What do you want to do about his request? Nothing, she said. I don't need an apology from him. He needs to give one. That's his business, she said. Not mine. Davis held her gaze. He had known Sarah Kincaid for 7 years, and he had learned across those years the specific shape of her silences. Which ones meant she was processing, which ones meant she had finished processing and arrived at a conclusion, and which ones meant she was saying something by not saying it. This was the third kind. All right, he said, you're stood down for 48 hours. Medical will want to look at the hand. It's fine. Medical will want to look at the hand, he repeated with the particular patience of a man who has learned that repeating himself is sometimes the only available tool. Yes, sir, she said. She stood up. She buttoned the top button of her jacket. She walked out. 0943. Tyler Brennan had not slept. He had gone back to the barracks at 0430 after the duty office released him, and he had lain on his bunk with his boots off and his eyes open and the ceiling above him doing nothing useful. And he had stayed there until 0600 when he got up and went to the administrative office and submitted the 2 documents he had been composing in his head for the previous hour and a half. The incident report was the harder one to write, not because he didn't know what to say, but because saying it required a degree of self-confrontation that he had been, by his own admission in the document, systematically avoiding for years. He wrote it plainly. He wrote what he had done and why he had done it and what he had believed when he did it, and he did not soften any of it, because softening it would have been the same dishonesty wearing different clothing. Deeks had found him at 0645 outside the administrative building, sitting on the steps with a cup of mom's that had gone cold. Deeks sat down beside him without being invited and without speaking for a while, which was still one of the more remarkable things Deeks was capable of. You submit something, Deeks said eventually. Yeah. About last night, about the bar. Tyler looked at the cold coffee. About what I am when I think nobody important is watching. Deeks was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing to write. It should be hard, Tyler said. If it wasn't hard, it wouldn't mean anything. Deeks nodded slowly. He turned the cup in his hands. The guys are going to want to know what's happening, about Jason, about all of it. Jason's fine, everyone's fine. Tyler paused. What I told them about the supply clerk, what I said in the bar. What I did, that's on me to correct. Not because I got caught, because it was wrong when I did it, and I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway. Deeks said nothing. She was sitting there reading, Tyler said. That's all she was doing, reading a field manual in a bar. And I made a choice about what kind of person does that, and I acted on the choice, and the choice was completely wrong in every direction. He finally looked at Deeks. You thought it was wrong too. You just didn't say anything. Deeks held his gaze. No, he said. I didn't. That's on you to figure out, Tyler said. I can only work on mine. They sat on the steps for another few minutes. The morning had fully arrived by then, clear and cold, the kind of October morning that feels like a pronouncement. Tyler drank the cold coffee because throwing it away seemed like one waste too many on a morning that had already accumulated enough of them. 0:10:15. Jason Brennan landed at Fort Campbell at 0:10:15, which was 40 minutes ahead of the revised schedule because the flight crew had once again pushed their airspeed into ranges they were not supposed to sustain for reasons that were by this point simply the established character of the night's operations. The wounded were transferred to the medical facility. The rest of Alpha Company was directed to debrief in sequence, which would take most of the day. Jason debriefed for 2 hours and 19 minutes. He was thorough, precise, and he told them everything exactly as it had happened, including the radio communications from the asset, including the fact that the asset had self-identified only as a friendly, had given no name, had operated throughout on a classified frequency, and had at no point behaved in any way that suggested she was operating outside a framework she had complete confidence in. When the debrief officer asked him to describe the asset's effectiveness, Jason was quiet for a moment. He had been thinking about how to answer this question since 0229 on the ridge, and he had not arrived at an answer that felt proportionate because there wasn't one. Proportionate answers exist when the thing being described fits inside existing categories. This did not. She changed the battle, he said finally. Not gradually, completely. From the moment she came on station, the entire dynamic of the engagement shifted. An assault force of nearly 200 fighters with heavy weapons, with a commanding position with established firing lines, she took all of that apart, alone, in the dark, over 150 minutes. He paused. I've been a soldier for 6 years. I've worked with exceptional people. I don't have a frame for what she did last night. I don't think the frame exists yet. The debrief officer wrote something down. One more thing, Jason said. Go ahead, Captain. I want it on record that whatever she's classified as, whatever her official designation is, whatever the Army thinks she is, she's more than that. Whatever the highest category is, she's above it. He met the debrief officer's eyes. Make sure that gets to whoever needs to see it. Understood, Captain. 1300. The call Tyler had been waiting for came at 1300, which was 1 hour after he had eaten his first real meal of the day, and 40 minutes after he had showered and changed and sat down in his room and tried to read something and failed to retain a single word of it. The call was from an administrative extension he didn't recognize, connected through the base operator, and the voice on the other end identified itself as an assistant to Colonel Davis, and it said that his formal request for a meeting had been reviewed and that the request had been declined. Tyler sat with that. Decline, he repeated. Yes, Sergeant. Was a reason given a brief pause. The relevant party indicated that no apology is required. Tyler closed his eyes. He had expected this, had half expected it from the moment he submitted the request, because the woman he had spent the last 12 hours thinking about was not he. Understood now the kind of person who needed things from people who had wronged her. She was not built for needing things from people who had wronged her. She was built for something else entirely. Something that operated at a different altitude than the need for acknowledgement or restitution. That understanding did not make the declined request easier to sit with. If anything, it made it harder. Because an apology offered and accepted is a transaction that resolves. An apology declined leaves the weight exactly where it started, with the person who earned it, and Tyler was going to carry this one without the resolution of delivery, which was, he thought, probably correct. Probably the right architecture for a lesson of this magnitude. You don't get to feel better about what you did just because you said sorry. You carry it. You change because of it. And the changing is the only thing that means anything. Thank you, he said. He ended the call. He sat in his room for a while. Then he got up and went to find his squad, 1400. They were in the common room, most of them. Deeks, Kowalski, Park, Ramirez, the others who had been at Murphy's Tavern the night before. They were eating or not eating, talking or not talking, doing the loose post-operation decompression that Rangers do when the adrenaline has fully cleared, and what remains is just the reality of what the last 24 hours contained. Tyler walked in and the room shifted, the particular atmospheric change that happens when the person who sets the tone of a group enters a space. They all looked at him. He stood in the center of the room and he said without preamble, without softening, I need to talk to you about last night, about the bar, about what I did. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of attention. They knew him well enough to know this was not the opening of a performance. This was something else. The woman we saw at Murphy's, he said, the one I called a supply clerk, the one I pulled off her bar stool. He looked around the room, making sure he had every face. She was in Helmand Province last night. She was the asset that command sent to pull Jason's company out of that valley. One operator against 200 fighters for 150 minutes. She held the entire engagement alone until reinforcements arrived. 97 enemy combatants, 48 Rangers alive. He let that land for a moment. Because of her. The room was very still. Deeks was looking at the floor. Park had put down whatever he was holding. Ramirez, who was the youngest in the squad, and who Tyler privately thought was also the most naturally decent, was looking at Tyler with an expression that was moving rapidly through several stages. I submitted an incident report on my own conduct this morning, Tyler continued. Self-reported. I'm not telling you this because I want credit for it. I'm telling you because what I did in that bar last night was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that goes beyond manners or protocol. I made a decision about who she was based on what I could see and what I thought I already knew, and I acted on that decision in a way that was, he paused because the word needed to be exact, contemptible. There's no other word for it, Ramirez said quietly. She saved Captain Brennan. She saved 48 people, Tyler said. And before she did that, I threw her off a bar stool and told her she didn't belong in uniform. The silence in the room had a specific texture now. It was not the silence of people who disagreed. It was the silence of people who were receiving something difficult and choosing to receive it properly. Kowalski said, "Did she know when she was at the bar? Did she already know she was going to be deployed?" "No," Tyler said. "The call came after she left. She had no idea when she was sitting there that the night was going to become what it became." He paused. She was just reading her field manual. That's all she was doing. That landed with particular weight, and Tyler could see it land, could see it move through each of them differently through Deeks, who had laughed the loudest at the time, and who was now studying his own hands with the focus of a man doing serious interior work through Park, who had said nothing at the bar, but had also not said anything to stop it through all of them, each sitting with their own specific version of the same reckoning. "I don't know how to fix this," Tyler said. She declined the apology. "So I'm going to carry it, and I'm going to change because of it, and that's what I'm asking each of you to do as well. Not for her sake, she doesn't need anything from us. For your own. Because the person you are when you think it doesn't matter is the person you actually are." He stopped. He looked around the room one more time. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Ramirez said, "What's her name?" Tyler looked at him. "I don't know her name. Not her real one, eh?" He paused. "She's classified. She goes by a designation." "What designation?" Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then Phantom 5. The name sat in the room. Deeks looked up almost his hands. His face had gone through enough in the last 12 hours that it had arrived at something new, something more honest than the easy confidence he usually wore, something that looked like a man who has had a significant portion of his self-image revised and is in the early stages of deciding what to build in its place. "Phantom 5, Deeks repeated. He said it the way people say things they want to fix in their memory. "Yeah," Tyler said, 01630. Jason Brennan found his brother at the east end of the airfield at 1630, which was where Tyler had told him he would be in the text he had sent at 1500. They had not seen each other in 4 months. Jason looked in the way that soldiers look after the specific kind of night he had just had, like someone who had been compressed and then released, thinner in the face, steadier in the eyes, with the particular quality of presence that people carry when they have recently been very close to something final and survived it. They shook hands first because they were Rangers, and that was the register they defaulted to in public, and then Tyler pulled him in and held on for a moment longer than the handshake warranted, and Jason let him because he understood what the extra moment was for. They stepped back. "You look terrible," Jason said. "I haven't slept," Tyler said. "I slept for 2 hours on the helicopter. I feel incredible." Jason looked at him. "Talk to me." Tyler told him. He told him about the bar, the full version, not the abbreviated one, the version with all the details of what he had done and said, and how he had done it and said it. He told it without mitigation, without the narrative moves that people make to make themselves look better in their own telling. He told it the way he had written the incident report plainly, because plainly was the only way that honored the weight of it. Jason listened without interrupting. That was one of the things Tyler had always respected about his younger brother. He was a better listener than most people twice his age, and he knew how to hold a story without rushing it toward a resolution that made him feel comfortable. When Tyler finished, Jason was quiet for a moment. On the radio, Jason said, "She never sounded like anything had happened to her, before the deployment, I mean. She sounded," he searched for the word clean, like she came into that night without any of it. She probably did, Tyler said. Not because it didn't happen, because she doesn't carry things the way we do. She processes differently. How do you know that? Tyler thought about the bar, about the $20 bill on the counter, about the button at the top of the jacket. Because I watched her not react to something most people would have reacted to very loudly, and then she walked out and did her job. He paused. She didn't need to process it. She had already put it somewhere. Jason looked at him. She saved my company, Tyler. 48 people, including me. A pause. And before she did that, you... I know, Tyler said. How do you sit with that? Tyler looked at the airfield. He looked at it for a while before he answered. Badly, he said. You sit with it badly, and then you figure out how to be different because of it, because that's the only thing you can actually do. Jason nodded slowly. He understood that. He was at his core a man who believed in the primacy of what you did with what you learned over what you felt about having learned it. She's still here, Jason said. On base. I don't know. Probably not for long. People like her don't stay in one place. Do you think she knows, Jason said, that it was your brother, that the company she was protecting? Davis told me she knew before she deployed, Tyler said. He told her Jason was Alpha Company's captain. He paused. She already knew who Jason was when she said yes. Jason absorbed that. He stood with it for a moment with the specific stillness of a person letting something fully arrive. She knew it was your brother, he said very quietly. And she went anyway. She went anyway, Tyler said. Not for me, not for you, because people were dying and she was the person who could do something about it. 01751. Sarah was in the supply warehouse. Not because she had been ordered there, not because anyone expected her to be working during her 48-hour stand-down. She was there because the supply warehouse was where she worked officially, and because the rhythm of ordinary things was for her the most reliable way to re-enter the world after operations. She was doing inventory, actual inventory, the counting and cataloging of equipment with the same focused attention she brought to everything. And the counting was a kind of meditation, a way of letting the mind move through simple, reliable numbers until the larger and less simple things settled to a manageable depth. She was on row 7 when she heard boots on the concrete floor behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She noted the sound, one-person male, heavier build, moving at a deliberate pace that was not casual, but was not aggressive, and she finished writing the number she was writing before she turned. Tyler Brennan was standing at the end of the row. He was in his duty uniform, and he looked like a man who had not slept, and he was holding his cover in both hands in front of him, with the specific posture of a person who has thought very carefully about what they are doing and has arrived at the conclusion that they are going to do it anyway, whatever the reception. Sarah looked at him, the same look she had given him in the bar, not cold, not warm, simply accurate, taking in information. Sergeant, she said. Specialist, he said, and the word came out with a slight catch in it because they both knew what the word meant and didn't mean, and the knowing was in the room with them. He said, I know you declined the formal request. I did, she said. I'm not here to override that, he said. I'm not here to make you accept something you don't want. He held her gaze. I'm here because I needed to look at you, not because it'll make me feel better, it won't, but because what I did was done to your face, and I think I owe you the honesty of saying what I'm going to say to your face. Sarah said nothing. She was watching him with the quality of attention that she brought to things she considered worth attending to, which was not nothing. I was wrong, he said. Not wrong in a small way. Wrong in a way that tells me something about who I am when I'm not paying attention to who I am. I made you into something manageable. Something I had a box for because the alternative was to actually look at you, and actually looking meant possibly seeing something that complicated my picture of myself. He paused. You complicated it anyway, just later, and at a much higher cost. The warehouse was quiet, the sound of the bass outside muffled by the walls, the hum of the fluorescent lights above them. I know my brother is alive because of you, Tyler said. I know 47 other people are alive because of you. And I know that none of that had anything to do with what I did or didn't do in that bar. You would have gone regardless. You went because that's who you are. Not because of me, not despite me. I was irrelevant to it. He looked at her steadily. That might be the most important thing I've ever had to admit about myself. That I was completely irrelevant to the most significant thing that happened in my vicinity in years. Sarah had not moved. She was still holding the clipboard. She was looking at him with an expression that was for the first time in his knowledge of her, which was short and not distinguished by accuracy, something he could partially read. Not forgiveness, not warmth exactly. Something more like acknowledgement, the recognition of a man who has arrived at a true thing by a hard route and is presenting it without decoration. She said, "You were right about one thing." He waited. "You said some people are built for the front and some people are built for the back." She held his gaze. "You were just wrong about which was which." Tyler Brennan stood in the supply warehouse at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, holding his cover in both hands, and he did not look away from her, and he did not try to fill the space that followed her words with anything, because there was nothing to fill it with. She was right. She had been right in the bar, and she was right now, and the distance between those two moments was everything the night had cost and everything it had taught. "Yes," he said, "I was." He put his cover back on. He straightened it. He looked at her one more time, the full look, the one he should have given her in the bar, the one that sees rather than categorizes. Then he nodded once, and he walked back down the aisle and out through the warehouse door, and Sarah watched him go, and then she turned back to her clipboard and wrote the next number in the sequence, and the counting continued. 01830. Deeks found Ramirez at the motor pool and said without explanation, "I've been thinking about last night." Ramirez looked at him. "Me too," Ramirez said. Deeks nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Some lessons arrive all at once, and some arrive in stages. And the ones that arrive in stages are the ones that actually change you because they give you the time to integrate each piece before the next one comes. And what Deeks was doing at the motor pool at 1830 was integrating. And Ramirez understood that, and they stood together for a while without talking, and that was enough. At the medical facility, the 7 wounded Rangers from Alpha Company were distributed across 3 rooms. Most of them were awake. Most of them were talking to each other, to the nurses, to the particular kind of silence that settles in medical facilities, and that soldiers learn to talk into rather than at. The man with the round in his thigh, a corporal named Duarte, was telling the story of the night to a nurse who had not asked for it, but was listening anyway, and he said, at the end of it, "We didn't know who it was. We still don't officially. But I'll tell you what I know. Whoever was on that ridge saved every single one of us. And they did it alone." He paused. "I want to know what that person is made of. I want to understand how a human being does something like that." The nurse said, "Maybe some people are just built that way." Duarte thought about that. "No," he said, "nobody's just built that way. You build yourself that way. Every day, every choice, everything you decide matters when nobody's watching. You build yourself toward that, or you don't." He looked at the ceiling. She built herself all the way. Sarah left the supply warehouse at 1900. She walked to the parking lot, unlocked her truck, and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. The same position, the same pause, the same truck as the night before. 23 hours ago, she had sat here and received a phone call that changed the shape of everything that followed. Tonight, the phone was quiet. She looked at the passenger seat. The fresh field manual was there, identical to the one that had been destroyed. She had placed it there this morning before the debrief because the manual was part of the routine, and the routine was how she stayed calibrated, and she did not intend to let one night, even a night of this magnitude, interrupt the things that kept her sharp. She picked it up. She opened it to the page she had been reading at the bar. She read. The base moved around her in the evening light. Formations, returning vehicles, cycling, the low, continuous sound of an institution that does not pause. Somewhere across the base, Tyler Brennan was having a conversation with his squad that would change how they move through the world. Somewhere, Jason Brennan was sleeping the sleep of a man who has been returned to his life from a very close distance and knows exactly how close it was. Somewhere in a valley in Helmand Province, the ground was settling back into its own silence, holding what had happened on it the way all ground holds what has happened on it, completely without comment. And in a truck in a parking lot at Fort Campbell, a woman who had spent the night holding 200 men at bay with 31 rounds, in the absolute fullness of who she was, turned a page of her field manual and kept reading because there was always more to know, and knowing was the only preparation that never ran out. The ones who change everything never look like they will. They look quiet. They look background. They look like the person at the end of the bar that nobody thinks to watch. They look from every angle that arrogance can see from like nothing at all. And then the night comes when the world needs something that cannot be summoned or manufactured or improvised. Something that can only be built slowly, privately, in the thousand ordinary moments when no one is watching, and it would be easy not to bother. And the person who built it steps forward, and the world finds out what it missed, and the world is never quite as certain of itself again. Sarah Kincaid turned another page. She was already preparing for the next night that would need her. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. And not one thing that had happened in the last 24 hours, not the contempt, not the beer, not the torn pages, not the ridge, not the 31 rounds, not the 48 lives, not the 97 had added to that or taken from it by a single degree. She had simply been herself completely in the dark. And that had been enough. That had been more than enough. That had been everything.